I'm gonna make a bold statement here and propose that the vast majority of you don't actually remember the original Pokemon games. What you really did was internalize years worth of YouTube content and overexposure to Gen 1's weakest points. Rather than simply pointing at all the weird and dated Gen 1isms and saying, well, it's Gen 1, I guess it can't be helped. I want to take a more thorough look at the original Pokemon games and their design. In truth, it's actually more intuitive than you'd think, and still holds up way better than anyone else on the internet would lead you to believe. It wasn't luck, it wasn't a fluke, and it's not just nostalgia. You just forgot how to enjoy Pokémon. So I've been noticing a lot of revisionism towards Pokémon accumulating over the years. This is not exclusive to Red, Blue, and Yellow in particular, as you can honestly see the same thing in other generations as well. But for this video, I'd rather focus on this whole narrative that the original Pokemon games were held together by duct tape and a dream. Its value has slowly been boiled down to just its novelty. This, on top of the fatigue towards nostalgic pandering in the modern titles, has likely lessened the modern Pokemon player's opinion on anything resembling a Kanto. To be clear here, I'm not trying to claim that people hate Gen 1 or Kanto now, that's just not true. But the way people perceive the original Pokemon games has definitely changed over time. Some people treat it like it was a phase. Oh, you know, we all grew up enjoying our Pikachus and our 80% accurate submission, but we're better now, don't you see? We've refined our palettes and raised our standards. Other people treat it like it was just a stepping stone before the series really got good. And depending on who you ask, the point in the series where it truly became great can vary from person to person. But the overall sentiment seems to be the same. It just aged poorly. That's a phrase I've been thinking about a lot recently. It's actually kinda the opposite. Games do get older, but they're not what's aging. The game itself doesn't change over time, but you know who does change as they get older? You. That's not the reason your standards are higher, by the way. I just wanted to point out that you're old. Yo, late 20s and over gang, I see you. Jokes aside, the reason your standards are higher now is because of the technology you surround yourself with today. There are people nowadays who use AI to write a 3-sentence email because they're just used to it. People adjust their needs to the current environment, and the world ain't static. The world changes faster than you'd expect, especially nowadays. The game itself, though, it's still the same as ever, no matter what state the world is in. Look, it's only natural that we become more used to having streamlined features as video games advance as a medium. I get that. I'm not here to tell you everything after Gen 1 is bad. Gen 1's not even my favorite. Or second favorite. But I stopped letting my enjoyment of the later games, like Platinum, hinder my enjoyment of the games before them. I stopped letting small holdovers like the physical special split, certain moves not being buffed yet, or not having features I liked sit in the back of my mind while I play. The value of a game should not be contingent on how its successors improve upon it, but rather what is actually there, and how it holds up compared to other games of its time. Before you start mashing on your keyboards, no, this does not mean the older game is immune to criticism. To the Persona fans in my audience, you already know I'm critical of games like Persona 2. The bad one, not the okay one. But I'm not critical of Persona 2 because it lacks the polish or mechanics that are specific to later games. All of my problems were with the game itself, and any mention of the later games basically boiled down to, no, Persona 2 didn't do it better, stop saying it did. Because that was the recurring claim that I was arguing against, not that Persona 2 is bad because the newer games are better. That being said, let's finally get into the actual contents of the games people are complaining about. If I were a gambling man, I'd probably be safe to assume that the vast majority of Gen 1 Pokemon content you've seen within the last decade has talked about the bugs and oversights in each of these games. Yeah, Gen 1 has a lot of bugs. The game was programmed by like 4 people in assembly, and that shit does not look fun to learn. It's not a sin to acknowledge or make mention of these things. The issue is how overstated this fact is. Like, realistically, you probably didn't know about the vast majority of Gen 1's glitches until you found out about it online. Furthermore, finding bugs in old games is basically its own genre of content made by people going out of their way to find and showcase these bugs. Not to say these bugs aren't flaws, they absolutely are. But part of what made Gen 1 so impressive is that it overcame the technical limitations of the Game Boy, even near the end of its life cycle, and pulled off feats that other games on the same hardware couldn't, even if it didn't come out unscathed. 151 unique, collectible, and tradable creatures was almost too ambitious back then. Transferring the data of said creatures between 2 separate games was a very new thing back then. New features and accessories would be developed alongside the next several generations. From backwards compatibility to wireless adapters to the fucking Pokewalker. Zach and Cody said it was cool, so it must be cool. It's one of the first NPC lines in the game. Technology is incredible. You wanna know why Pokemon Go popped off so hard early on? It's because AR technology was still relatively new, and this was the only cool thing anyone was doing with it. In a lot of ways, the older Pokemon games hold up better than the later entries like Scarlet and Violet, games that give off the exact opposite image, not overcoming their technical limitations but rather struggling to keep up with it at all, when other, more expansive RPGs exist on the same platform. You could probably count on one hand how many Gen 1 glitches you've run into on a single playthrough without actively looking for them. And the number of glitches you've run into that actually put you in an unplayable state? I'd assume 0. But because of how overexposed we are to these bugs that will probably never be relevant to us, we've sorta turned that into its whole identity. It's to the point where people have unironically started saying, I like Gen 1 because it's a buggy mess. Now, don't get me wrong, some bugs are fun to strategize around once you know how they work, like crit hacks or stacking badge boosts. Even moves not working as intended can have strategic value, like Hyper Beam recharge skips or focus energy lowering your crit rate so your stat increases don't get ignored by them. I don't know what the hell a backwards long jump is, but that wasn't intentional design either. And people still love it. It just feels like a really overcorrective sentiment to say, I like it because it's such a hot mess. Or maybe even an excuse to justify your enjoyment of something when you really shouldn't need one. This one's less of a bug and more of an oversight, but I might as well mention the enemy AI as well. I'ma be real with you, I didn't know about 99% of the weird opponent behavior aside from maybe the retroactive item usage. The first time I even heard about the AI picking moves based on type advantages, regardless of whether they deal damage or not, was in a Picaspree video. This was also the same video I discovered the opponent has infinite power points. Again, much of this knowledge is largely in retrospect. The enemy AI in other RPGs at the time was mostly random, so the fact that opponents in Pokemon even take things like type advantages into account is arguably a step up. The fact that there are AI exploits doesn't necessarily make it bad either. Exploiting enemy AI is, and always has been, a valid strategy, even in the most polished games. And again, this isn't a matter of the game breaking the moment you look at it wrong. This is a very specific exploit you probably didn't discover on your own. We've turned Gen 1 into a spaghetti code museum, something that we just sort of marvel at second-handedly, but never experienced most of in our actual lifetime. It started off as just the Mew glitch, Missing No, and Glitch City. See, back then, we thought those bugs were cool. It wasn't some big funny meme, and we didn't think any less of these games for it. Nowadays, we got a whole exhibit of old relics from the past we didn't know about until long after their time. And yet, just the knowledge of them has been etched into our memories. It's like staring at the bags under your eyes for too long. In your head, they start to look worse than they actually are after a while. You look fine, by the way. On the topic of things looking fine, something I've just kinda gotten over is the archaic sprite work, particularly the ones from Pokémon Red, Green, and Blue. Yeah, we all thought these sprites looked weird in these games. A big part of it is the inconsistencies between how the Pokémon looked in-game compared to the anime, which a lot of us were probably exposed to first. But even that aside, many of these Pokémon sprites just look strange on the whole. In fact, up until a year or two ago, I would always just patch the game to replace the sprites whenever I replayed them. But then, in the year 2018, some anonymous users on the internet would leak the ROM files for Pokémon Gold and Silver's Space World demo. I'm not gonna go into detail about the demo itself. The only thing I wanted to mention from it was the sprite work. They aren't quite in the style of what the final Gold and Silver sprites would look like. Logically, it follows that these beta sprites would be a stylistic half-step between Gens 1 and 2, but honestly leaning a bit more towards the first gen. In fact, a good 1/3 of most of the front sprites are the same as Blue versions. This actually got me to appreciate Gen 1's art direction, and I think I see something there that I didn't before. Putting the Space World sprites in between Gen 1 and 2 sprites shows a very clean transition, or rather makes that transition much more clear. The designs of old are more reminiscent of classic RPG monsters. When you think of more standard RPG enemies, you don't usually envision them as these marketable cuddly creature sidekicks, at least most of the time. I think most would describe these creatures as weird, unnerving, or perhaps even ugly. And when you really get down to it, that kinda perfectly describes what Pokémon was back in the day. Old Pokémon was weird. Have you read the NPC dialogue in these games? What about all the Pokédex entries that made you tilt your head or genuinely unsettled? Pokémon was an oddball RPG, not too dissimilar to the likes of Earthbound. Wait, before it ever became the cuddly, marketable empire it is today. That's not to say the goal wasn't to make Pokémon as marketably appealing as possible. The artwork based off the sprite designs was clearly tweaked to better fit this objective. However, artwork from the official Pocket Monsters Zukon, one of the earliest Pokémon guidebooks, still contains artwork alongside the official renders, depicting them in more anatomical detail. They really did lean a lot more into Pokémon as strange animals than cute woodland creatures. It wouldn't be until the Pokémon anime when they would finally feed into the more cutesy side of their designs. Do keep in mind that the Pokémon anime started around the time when Gold and Silver began production, hence Ho-Oh appearing in the first episode. All this to say, the way we perceive Pokémon today, or hell even as early as Generation 2, is something that Pokémon kinda had to evolve into. No pun intended. Another angle to my new fondness of Gen 1 sprites actually stems from a critique that many people have about the newer games. From the very minimal changes to the Pokémon models over time to the very repetitive animations, Pokémon games have just had a very samey look for well over a decade at this point. Even when the older games brought back Pokémon from previous generations, they still managed to make them look distinct from gen to gen. You got to see them drawn in different poses that were even animated sometimes upon appearance in battle as early as Pokémon Crystal. After a certain point though, it feels like it just stagnated. In this sense, I've come to really respect Gen 1 sprites for being distinct and unabashedly weird. It's part of what makes it so recognizable, and now it's something I'd rather not patch out upon replay. You know that old meme of Hitmonchan's green sprite? You know, how it resembles a Togekiss peeping at a Doduo taking a dump? A normal person in 2026 would be horrified by that. Me, on the other hand, I think this sprite is based. Not because I think it looks particularly good, I just think traumatizing people with this knowledge is funny. Hell, there are later gen Pokemon that are designed to be ugly. But to my surprise, even those Pokemon are still some people's favorites. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I suppose. Or maybe ugly, in the case of creature designs, has its appeal too. I'm not even trying to make an argument here, I just find this subject really interesting. Even outside the sprite work for the creatures, I feel like I've only recently come to fully appreciate the aesthetic of these games as a whole. So on the surface, you might be thinking, it's just a Game Boy game, it's just a dark green screen, isn't it? And normally, yes, it would be. But we have technology. Fortunate kids in the 90s would be able to play these games on their Super Game Boy. This gave every town in Pokemon their own distinct color. Which is nice, don't get me wrong, but it's not quite how I grew up playing them. If you were born just a little bit later, you could play these games on the Game Boy Color or Game Boy Advance.
Like me.
And each game would have their own distinct color scheme. Yeah, exclusive encounters aren't the only difference between the different versions. Red and blue are pretty straightforward. Red version uses red for its environments, with green for all the NPCs, interactable objects, and battle animations. Blue version more or less does the same. Blue environments with red entities and animations. Green version, the one we never got in the West, actually does something a bit different. Instead of having a 2-color palette, it actually has 3. Interestingly enough, it uses blue for its darks while using green for its lights. The entities on the overworld and battle animations are still red though. This is ultimately inconsequential and very subjective, but I think this actually gives the game a nice return to nature feel to it. Befitting for a game where the protagonist travels the world on foot, through tall grass, forests, and caves. I also just can't help but think of Greenberry Rush, the best Hawaiian Punch flavor by the way, when I look at it. Red and blue can invoke different feelings from green, which can make the experience of each game more distinguishable. Red invokes excitement. You think the Matador's capote is red because it aggroes the bull? No, it's red to excite the crowd. Blue invokes feelings of calm, like staring up at a clear blue sky or gazing upon a nice clear blue ocean. It's less varied than playing the games with Super Game Boy colors, but I feel like if you're going to release the same game 3 times with minimal differences, the visual distinction is the least you can do. And the least I can do as a creator is ask if you're enjoying the video so far. If the answer is yes, then take a second to click that subscribe button. But anyways, you want to know another visual difference between versions? When people talk about the graphical enhancements from Japanese red and green to blue and international red and blue, they only mention the Pokémon sprites. But what if I told you there was a change that was hiding in plain sight? It's literally right in your face, but still somehow went under everyone's noses. Once I tell you this, you'll never be able to unsee it. Are you ready? Okay. Pokémon Blue uses completely different tile sets. What, you never noticed? Yeah, I didn't either. But if you put the games side by side, the differences become way more apparent. From the grass to the walls to the normal ground textures to even the signposts and the roof slopes. If you go down to the water, you'll notice the ocean looks different too. But wait, you might be saying, I swear I've seen these older textures too. And that's because you have. They still use modified versions of the original ground and grass textures in the Safari Zone, and the original water texture is used in the Safari Zone, Silphco, Seafoam Island, and Cerulean Cave. I guess that's part of the reason why it's so easy to miss. You're already kinda predisposed to both tile sets, so they start to blend together in your head. I haven't had a Mandela effect moment like this since the Berenstain Bears. I'm sure some of you watching already knew this, but this is one of those fun facts that actually isn't stated enough. In fact, we should curse more people with this knowledge, so they can argue over even stupider shit, like whether the original or revised tile sets look better. Another fairly common sentiment you just cannot avoid out in the wild is that Kanto is boring because it has the least going for it. To that I say, I'm sorry to hear that, because I really don't see it that way. The thing about subsequent generations is that they had to sell people on what they're gonna do differently from the last game. Generation 1 had to sell people on the idea of Pokémon, period. Sure, you could go all in with a really good story, characters, and hey, maybe even the gameplay's fire. You could hit the nail on the head for all of those things, but that does not guarantee your game is gonna be a huge hit. Insert Digital Devil Saga here. Praised by both players and critics alike, but still didn't reach the heights it expected. I'm willing to bet most of you who aren't my longtime subscribers have even heard of it. That could have easily been Pokémon as well. So what did make Pokémon pop off? Well, sometimes less is more. When Pokémon Red and Green initially released, Tsunekazu Ishihara described the initial reception as a quiet start. Though the games would see a huge turnaround all because of one hidden secret kept within the game. It's often described as a prank or an act of mischief by the programmer, Shigeki Morimoto. However, the way he describes it makes it sound more like an inside joke that everyone, including creator Satoshi Tajiri, was in on. Seeing that there was a little bit of space left in the cartridge, Morimoto figured, why not, and hid one last Pokemon in the game's data. Not even knowing for certain if it would ever get the chance to see the public eye. But thanks to an unforeseen bug, some players would end up encountering this secret Pokemon. No, this was not the aptly titled Mew glitch. That wasn't discovered until the early 2000s. I can't find any absolute confirmation on this, but this was most likely the Old Man glitch that could result in the player encountering Missingno, among other Pokemon based on their name and trainer ID. It's a much easier glitch to pull off that I could feasibly see people stumbling upon by pure accident. And this would also mean that not every player would have encountered Mew, even when replicating the same methods. Nowadays, hiding secrets in your game is about as effective as leaving the back door to your company building unlocked. It just doesn't work. At least, not in the same way as before. The most modern equivalent to the Mew mystery I can think of is... Okay, hear me out now. The Five Nights at Freddy's lore. Listen, people were absolutely nuts when they first caught wind of Mew, and they wanted to get to the bottom of it. This resulted in all sorts of rumors and myths on how or where to find it. Playground rumors were basically the 90s equivalent of FNAF theories in that, at the time, there was no way to definitively prove anything. All we had were romanticized and speculative stories based on a few journal entries and some faulty code, but zero official confirmation. Until Game Freak figured, fuck it, cat's out of the bag, let's give it away! I guess they didn't want to leave us in an endless cycle of theory crafting. So what exactly did that prove, you might be asking? I just explained the whole appeal of Pokémon, seeking the unknown. It's what got people to scrape the region and later discover places like the Truck by the SS Anne, and Bill's Secret Garden. Landmarks can tell their own stories, or maybe their stories are waiting to be told. To use a real-life example, take Stonehenge. In the grand scheme of things, it's a pile of rocks. It's no use to us. But it's only when you inspect the details more thoroughly when you start to think. It's clearly arranged in a very structured manner, but what was it for? That's when you start to speculate based on the context of the culture and its datedness. Then you have a few actually smart people look at these things, and all of a sudden it's the most famous landmark in the country. That's kind of what a lot of Kanto is. On the in-universe side, you have places like the power plant. What was this plant powering before it was abandoned? Seems like a no-shit kind of question, but then you remember that Zapdos is just chillin' here. The fact there's enough power to attract a legendary Pokemon should raise some eyebrows. A previous power source for the region that became obsolete? If so, what replaced it? If not, then what the hell did they need all this power for? Then you've got the Pokemon Tower, a cemetery for Pokemon. So, what happens when they run out of room? Do they just keep building up, or do they start building down? Has anyone taken a second to think about how there are actual ghosts in this place capable of possessing humans? How often do you think about the distinction between a ghost and a ghost Pokemon? The game gives you zero answers for these things, but the appeal was that it got you to think about it for a prolonged amount of time. These things linger in your brain because they left just enough details for you to mull over. Now, tell me if the story sounds familiar. Series creator Satoshi Tajiri grew up in the once rural Machida, Tokyo, where he would spend his younger years collecting bugs and exploring nearby forests and lakes. Yeah, that story. The origin and inspiration for Pokémon. One of the things a lot of people have already pointed out in these games is how they very much reflect this change that was happening in Tajiri's life, the rural being replaced with the metropolitan life. However, something that I don't think is stated enough is how the games never go as far to paint the growth of urban life as an outright bad thing. Even while apartment buildings and malls were being built over Tajiri's old home, he didn't reject the city life. He eventually began taking interest in anime, manga, and especially electronics. I mean, we wouldn't be here right now if that wasn't the case, right? As mentioned earlier, Pokémon games love to marvel over the advancements of technology, both with its real-life hardware and in-universe. You see how much technology conveniences the people of Kanto, including the player. The Pokédex is an electronic encyclopedia that Professor Oak invents and is clearly excited to see the player fill out. Pokémon centers just have free healing machines open to all Pokémon trainers. The big tech company of the region invents and advertises a device that's required for you to see certain encounters. They never frame places like the department store in a bad light. You know, the types of places being built over Tajiri's old home. Hell, even the convenience of keeping your creature companions in pocket-sized capsules is a technological advancement specifically tailored towards you. Hence the term pocket monsters. Pokémon is about the potential of science, and embraces it a lot of the time. However, they also show the harm that comes with it when done carelessly without taking the broader ecosystem into account. So, Kanto has a lot of poison types. It's no wonder why psychics are so dominant in this region, but that's beside the point. I saw this really good video about how this in itself might be a form of negative reinforcement, to train the player to associate the poison type with danger. Whether it be the natural kinds of venoms you can find in plants or the more man-made toxins that are a result of human pollution. You got shit like wheezing that's a literal tumor and muck that's a pile of pollution. And also, poison is the type that all the bad guys use. I recommend watching the full video, which I'll link in the cards in the description. Even outside poison types, there are plenty of Pokemon that are either man-made or likely the result of some industrial disaster. Then you just have straight-up bombs. And suddenly that great Pokemon war Surge was talking about makes a lot more sense. Speaking of people sucking sometimes, let's talk about Team Rocket, Kanto's Mafia, but they're referred to as just a gang, probably because most kids wouldn't know what the word mafia means. I know I sure didn't. We've kind of inflated our expectations for antagonist teams when they started trying to be philosophical and push their worldview through force. I've come to appreciate Team Rocket in Gen 1 specifically for how down-to-earth they are. Team Rocket is a constant presence, but they're not the main antagonists. They're kind of just accepted as part of the world, a result of human cruelty left unchecked in a world full of innovation, and people wanting to use said innovation to gain power. It's kinda scary how much influence Team Rocket has, despite how aware the citizens are of them. Running a casino, game corner, to get people to gamble or spend exorbitant amounts of money on coins. If you want to use those premium TMs, then you're definitely just as guilty for playing into their pockets. They also have scientists in Sylph, who are more loyal to Team Rocket than to Sylphco. The fact that they're specifically scientists is also kinda telling. There truly are some people who will use their talents for anything if they get paid well enough. And let's not forget the biggest elephant in the room, the gym that's owned by the boss of Team Rocket. I seriously doubt this was the result of incompetent moderation on the Pokemon League's part. Based on my past two examples, I think it's safe to assume this is another exhibit of Team Rocket having money and influence in the right places, even in ones you might not expect. All this to say, we've really lost track of what Pokemon was really about after all these years. Pokemon's about finding adventure in the current world as it is, not being dragged along by a heavily involved story. Whether it be a humble rural setting like the one Tajiri grew up in, walking down the metropolitan streets, speeding down the bike path, or even just talking to people around town to learn more about the place. The steps you take on your journey are their own stories. It's the personalized moments that really stick with you in these games. Why do you think we liked Pokemon Let's Plays growing up so much? This is even reflected in how flexible Kanto's badge progression is. One of the standout memories from when I first played Pokemon Blue is how I got stuck in Sylphco. Not because I couldn't find the card key, I had it. I just didn't think to press the A button on the individual doors. I thought you had to swipe the card key in like a card reader, but that wasn't the case. So you know what I did? I just surfed to Cinnabar Island instead. And I felt like a genius for realizing I could do that. For the experienced player who knows what they're doing, it can actually benefit you to do gyms out of order depending on what team members you're catching. If you didn't pick Squirtle or evolve Magikarp into Gyarados, you basically have to wait until after waking up Snorlax to get the Super Rod to fish up any other water types. Or worse, wait until you can surf on a Nidoking or something to Seafoam Island. You're probably going to choose fishing. And the Pokemon you can catch will only be around levels 15 to 23? What about Safari Zone catches? Let's say you want to try a bunch of different Pokemon instead of running the generic Gen 1 team of Starter, Pidgeot, Nido, Evolution. But the availability of some of the quirkier choices are blocked off by certain progress checks. This is a case where putting off some areas and their trainers for later might be better for training your new team members. Do the absolute bare minimum requirements to reach X area, and just focus on broadening your options before fully committing to a team and going all in on them trainer battles. It made my recent returning playthroughs feel really interesting, albeit a bit disjointed. Gen 1 achieves this very strange balance between linearity and open-ended game progression. I've always felt like this kind of thing works better in smaller condensed worlds with lots of unique areas, than in massive world maps with, quite frankly, way too much empty space. Kanto and even Johto to a tiny extent were great because you could loop around the region in different directions, but there were still enough restrictions with HMs based on which badges you have, rather than how many. You were still required to do a majority of the game's content, but it wasn't presented as a bunch of different quest lines that you could progress however you want. Rather, Kanto's contents are all treated like pieces of the same puzzle. Sometimes you might get stumped and not know what to do with the pieces you're holding, so you move on to fill in other areas instead. Then the picture becomes clearer, and picking up the remaining pieces becomes a smoother process from there on. And by the time you're done with all that, you're already at the league gates. The game gives you basically the perfect amount of experience points to handle the Elite Four, despite the level difference. Half the badges you've collected give you a 12.5% boost across all of your Pokemon stats. That, as well as the hidden stat experience mechanic, narrows the gap between you and the opponents even further. The only things left to ensure victory are type coverage and skill. Your team building is also tied to a little bit of resource management and your powerful move options. Brock makes sure to tell you that TMs are one-time use only, and while some can be purchased indefinitely, the rest are one of a kind. Ideally, you should make them count, but you're never totally screwed. Most gym leaders only have one Pokemon with their signature TM move, while the rest are running their very limited level up moves. While it's a valid complaint that some TM moves are very questionably balanced or just outright bad, they can still greatly supplement what you're left to work with through level up moves alone. The devs basically have no assurance that the player is going to commit to any given Pokemon they decide to use. If you blow a really good TM on someone but later realize it would have suited a different team member better, that's just something you gotta live with. You're still left with other options though, even if they're not your first choice. And it's not like there are no Pokemon with serviceable enough level up moves to act as a discount version. Like, if you actually have zero good moves to work with, that's just a failure on your part. You'd have to actively be deleting any good level up moves you do get. It adds more value to some of the more average moves in the game. And hey, if all else fails, you can always fall back on good old HM04. Not as good as Body Slam, but infinitely reusable by the way. Mega Kick has a 1 in 4 chance to miss, but it packs harder. I don't know if it's just me, but nothing about what I just said sounded boring to me. This just sounds like a video game that trusts its young player base to explore thoroughly at their own pace, make observations, put the pieces together, and overcome the obstacles in front of them. So for some reason, I keep seeing stuff on YouTube about how Gen 1 has no post-game. Granted, most of these videos were pretty lighthearted and don't really spend that much time complaining per se. I don't know if it's quite reached meme status like the sprite work or the glitches, but I'll talk about it anyway. Something important to keep in mind is that most games at the time, let alone RPGs, didn't even have post-game content. Most of them wouldn't even boot you to the title screen after the credits, they would just hang once they reached the end text. Gen 1 offers a post-game dungeon where you can catch some evolved Pokemon, instead of needing to take the time to level some of them, for the players looking to fill out their Pokedex. In addition to this, you now have an easier way to catch the elusive Chansey, being able to weaken it for easier capture. Another rad thing about Cerulean Cave is that it has a completely different dungeon layout depending on which version you're playing. But of course, the cherry on top is being able to challenge and potentially capture the game's strongest Pokemon. Consider it a secret boss of sorts. Like a lot of secret bosses, you could always use the cheesiest method. In this case, that would be throwing your Master Ball at it. But if you were like me as a kid and used it on Articuno because you ran out of Pokeballs, forgot to save, and didn't want to do all of Seafoam Island over again, you had to take on this challenge clean. Defeating Mewtwo with a full team of 6 isn't all too hard, but the challenge comes from withstanding Mewtwo's onslaught long enough until you can finally see those 3 shakes. Or you could play green version where Blizzard has a 30% freeze rate. By conventional RPG standards in the 90s, this was a pretty solid post-game, with the only other remaining thing being to catch 'em all. Now, the prospect of finding friends to trade with and help you obtain more Pokemon may seem like a lost art of a bygone era. But I actually managed to do it. I didn't physically get people together, but rather, I used the power of modern technology. Game Boy emulation with link cable functionality has existed for a while now. Make no mistake though, I did not have to play through both red and green to achieve this goal by myself. Some very generous internet users over at Project Pokémon were kind enough to put their save files up for download, thereby keeping the spirit of the game somewhat intact. I still had to find another person to trade with, and I could tell a lot of time and love was put into this save file. You can tell just by looking at their Pokémon that a lot of work or memories or both were poured into it, even if I'll never know what they entailed. Gen 1 probably has the least demanding Pokédex to complete, but it's still very fulfilling. And I feel that alone fills the void of a lack of post-game that other Pokémon games just couldn't pull off. But in case you're still left wanting for more, look no further than Pokémon Stadium. Now, I would love to go in depth about why these games are awesome, but that would honestly warrant its own video. For the scope of this video, I'll keep it brief. You might be thinking, isn't it a bit demanding to ask someone to buy a whole other game on a completely different console to get your post-game? Normally, yes, but I know the majority of you are playing these games on an emulator. I'll link a tutorial in the description on how to use your emulator saves to transfer Pokémon. The Stadium games on their own are not very fun to play. Coming off the back of a mainline game, however, the fun factor goes up immensely. What's this? Gym leader rematches? Tournament modes with their own rules and formats? Those sound very post-game-esque if you ask me. And if you think it's gonna be easy just because you brought your own Pokémon, you got another thing coming. You wanna know the best part? You can do the same thing in Stadium 2. You don't even need a Gen 2 save file, so now you can literally take your Kanto team into the Johto League, just like Ash Ketchum. But again, all this stuff is supplementary. It ultimately feels kinda silly to be placing this much importance on what is ultimately bonus content. I had a whole rant ready for this subject, but I have a gut feeling it'd be better to save that for a potential Gen 2 video. Speaking of supplementary material, let's finally talk about Pokémon Yellow. It is a light tie-in for the anime, where you take on Pikachu as your first Pokémon. Just like Ash Ketchum, you can later obtain all 3 of the standard starter Pokémon from NPCs fairly early on in your journey. Just like Ash Ketchum. You can even kick around Jesse and James, just like Ash Ketchum. If you couldn't tell, this game is very much an Ash Ketchum power fantasy. Whether you want to roleplay as him, or maybe you're one of those kids who be like, Ash is so stupid, I could do way better than him. If I were Ash, I would let all my Pokémon evolve. The game will not let you evolve your Pikachu, by the way. I can see the appeal in this, really I do. But would I say it's better than Red, Green, and Blue? No. There are some minor improvements compared to the standard releases. Major trainer fights have had their AI changed to not choose moves solely based on type, but to my knowledge, that mostly just means they've been changed to act randomly. They've also had their movesets improved instead of just running level up moves. The actual team selections, on the other hand, are very questionable. 3 Venonat and a Venomoth is certainly a design choice. You know, in case the anime reference wasn't clear after the first one. For some reason, they thought giving him even less species representation was a good idea. The sprite work also changed to match closer to the anime. In fact, some of these sprites are just slight edits from the Gold and Silver Space World demo. Yeah, that was in development before Yellow was released. The new sprites ironically look more accurate to the anime than any of the future game sprites ever would. For the most part. This game also follows suit with the Super Game Boy color palette of RGB. giving pretty much the same colors to each designated area, only more vibrant to better suit the Game Boy Color. At least in the international releases. In Japan, Pokémon Yellow was developed before the Game Boy Color was a thing, so the color palette on GBC is just yellow and red. Yo, look at this Happy Meal-ass game. The grass looks like french fries, the cylinders look like drink cups, the signs look like menu boards, and the mountains look like cheese-melted burger patties. If I didn't know any better, I'd assume this game was made just for a McDonald's campaign, but it wasn't, as far as I could find. The Super Game Boy colors are mostly the same as the International's Game Boy Color colors. They're just not all there, if you catch my drift. The colors in general are something most emulators aren't able to replicate due to the lack of adjustments for modern screens. If you want the most visually accurate emulator for Game Boy Color games, I'd suggest BGB. It's not as user-friendly as some other emulators, but it does look the best in my opinion. If you want to play red, green, blue, or any original Game Boy game in GBC colors though, you'll need a GBC boot ROM. Otherwise it defaults to DMG or Super Game Boy colors. If you don't know what the hell a GBC boot ROM is or where to get it, look it up. Unfortunately, I was unaware of this when I first started working on this video, and ended up playing RGB on Same Boy using its modern accurate filter as a compromise. If you prefer your colors a little more vivid, or you want something really user-friendly, Same Boy is still a pretty damn good emulator. But enough splitting hairs over emulation differences. Let's split hairs over the player experience instead. So, as novel as having the ability to assemble an Ash Ketchum-esque team is, it does kinda de-incentivize experimentation with team building. Like, the game essentially fills out 4 of your team slots for you. That, on top of the other Pokemon the game will just give to you, means that you could theoretically build an entire team of Pokemon without actually catching a single one. You could go out of your way to not use the starter Pokemon. Hell, you could even choose not to use Pikachu either. But like, that kinda defeats the whole appeal of playing Yellow, doesn't it? You might as well just be playing RGB at that point. Then again, I imagine there must have been a lot of kids who only had Pokemon Yellow growing up, so if they wanted to shake things up, that probably would have been the only way for them to do it. Either way, I think Pokemon Yellow is a fun game, but I don't view it as the superior third version people have conditioned themselves to default to. And since I brought up that topic, I might as well close out with what this video isn't about. Firstly, Fire Red and Leaf Green. These are good games, I like them. But regardless of whether you'd personally choose them over the originals, they are not Gen 1. Fire Red and Leaf Green are irrefutably Gen 3 games, both from a technical standpoint and as experiences. And of course, the same thing applies to the Let's Go games. Those are kinda their own beast separate from any other generation, to be honest. I stopped trying to substitute games with their remakes a long time ago. You actually end up enjoying video games a lot more that way. But another thing I've been thinking about in terms of trying to fix or substitute old games is the ROM hacking scene. I appreciate ROM hacks that fix bugs and restore content to how it was originally intended to be. In most cases, I'm not one of those guys who will tell you you didn't really play the game if you used a patch to fix the bugs or clean up the translation. But as I've talked about in depth already, we've kinda entered this weird territory where we've made the bugs part of Gen 1's identity. Even putting that whole philosophical debate aside, I feel like once you start adding content to the game, even if it was originally planned content, it's kinda just becoming its own thing. When you start changing the way certain mechanics work, or just change the way the game plays, that's absolutely not the same game anymore. And I'm not saying this to spite these ROM hacks. I've played a few hours of pure RGB, and while it takes a lot of creative liberties, it still shows a lot of respect for the base games. It doesn't backport or update the battle mechanics to the current gens, but it does add new moves and change the type combinations of a lot of Pokemon. And then you have the GOAT, Shin Pokemon Red, Green, and Blue. It's an extremely faithful remaster that introduces its changes very subtly over the course of your playthrough, but it does eventually snowball into its own experience with its own merits. Not quite Gen 1, but Gen 1 Plus. I could spend a whole ass video gushing over Shin Pokemon, and maybe mention some other ones. But unfortunately, that sounds more like a bonus video for my Patreon. I'm normally reluctant when it comes to paywalling content, but I know it's really rough out there right now, so I figured I should really start giving my members more in return for their extended support. It's $1 forever, unless you choose to donate more. All this to say, the internet really does have more influence over our thoughts than we'd like to admit. Hell, the passionate defense I just made you sit through? Even that was the result of the overflow of the same information being regurgitated constantly. It's like retroactively poisoning the well. Instead of poisoning it beforehand, it's done long after the person has played the original games and probably doesn't have the clearest memory of them. Then that memory gets replaced with a meme of its former self. And once something becomes a meme, the nuance of the discussion kinda starts to get lost. And while of course, it isn't wrong to simply point out these things, it's 2026 guys, we all know how to look things up on Bulbapedia. We've officially reached, did you know that Devil May Cry was going to be Resident Evil 4? Levels of overstated. Next you'll be making the 1000th Ash is a bad trainer joke. This is the part where most people would dock points for nostalgia, because apparently when you review a game, you have to pay a nostalgia tax that scales based on how young you were when you first played it. Subtract that from your real score, and what you're left with afterwards is the objective score. People who feel like they have to reconcile their opinions with the general consensus are really insecure and probably not very fun to talk to. For real though, the most anti-intellectual thing you can do when discussing any piece of media is to write off people's enjoyment as, was it really good or were you just 12? You know, kids aren't as dumb as you think. They may not be mature enough to articulate it, but they do understand why games appeal to them. And devs understood to respect the intelligence of their player base, at least back then they did. Maybe we should start doing the same with each other. We need to stop treating nostalgia as a point against older games. Nostalgia doesn't prove a game is good, but it doesn't diminish any of its merit either. You see, back then, we weren't calling it nostalgia, we just called it enjoying the games. And you know, maybe we should just go back to calling it that. Maybe you still enjoy the games as much as you did back then, or maybe you don't. And that's perfectly fine. Something that I've sorta had to relearn in the past year or so is how to enjoy games in isolation. I don't talk with people in the wider online discussion anymore. I keep it down to just me and a few select people. Privately. Don't let anyone tell you this is putting yourself in an echo chamber. My friends and I do not agree on everything. Gotta listen to these clowns argue over anime. And overall, I just think it's more enjoyable and productive to get inside people's headspaces, which is easier to do in a more intimate discussion. Not saying you have to completely unplug from the internet, you just don't have to include everyone in on the conversation. I like talking to people, not arguing with feeds and algorithms. There's a pretty big difference between a healthy discussion with an individual and having a long argument thread with randos online. Maybe instead of relying on the internet to remind you of everything, you really ought to just boot up the game, play it, and let it speak for itself. Engage with as much of it as you can. Sometimes that really is all it takes to remember how to enjoy Pokémon.